Welcome to the PIDE webinar.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure.
I think Michael Blastland is here now, so let us begin. We have a wonderful webinar today. Michael Blastland, I read his book, The Hidden Half, and I was really inspired by it. It's a great book. It says and gives evidence for something that needs to be said. We live in the age of data, and we have absolutely absurd confidence in data, even though we don't do our statistics right. And Michael, it's even worse here. At least out there, you have commentators who can comment on this thing and create a debate. But out here, we seem to think data is God, even though we don't even know how to interpret it. So I'm really glad that we have you here to give us chapter and verse in the research in this subject. So I will not stand between you and Michael Blastland. Michael Blastland is a well-known writer, author. He has been contributing to many publishing houses, places. And he's written this book, as I told you, The Hidden Half, which is a very good analysis, in fact, a synthesis of all the research on data and all the research on how data is to be treated, thought about, and despite our best efforts to understand data, we may still be fooled. So this quote that he's got of Voltaire is a wonderful quote, and you should all remember it, that doubt is not pleasant, but certainty is absurd. And Michael, let me also tell you that here in Pakistan, we have absolute certainty on everything. We know a lot of things. And we unfortunately think that we can solve all the problems of the world with our certainty. So with that, let me bring Michael Blastland to talk about the hidden half and to talk about data and how to interpret it. Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words and the generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak, and and thank you for the summary of the book as well. I think you capture it very nicely. I am not a researcher. I don't really discover things. I don't do primary research, though I do look at all kinds of evidence in the course of my own work as a journalist, and I very often wonder if it's all it's supposed to be. So overall, I'm less at the technical end of the problem, I guess, of knowing what's going on out there, and I'm at the end which talks about how we talk about evidence, how we characterize to ourselves what we know, and especially how we communicate that. Now, I'll summarize very briefly the argument I'm going to make, which is that evidence, as I see it at least, is seldom as definitive or simple as it's claimed, and I include research in that. I think we are far more ignorant than we admit, and I mean very deeply, fundamentally ignorant. In some cases, I go beyond uncertainty. I prefer us to say ignorant when we are ignorant. I think in politics and other areas of leadership, we are bedeviled by hype, various biases and overconfidence, often based on statistical naivety. And on the whole, the problem before decision makers is juggling uncertainties. It's working out how to manage a state of uncertainty when we say, I'm just not sure. This means we have less control over the way that policies and other practical outcomes will work out. But despite all this, we congratulate ourselves that actually we're rather good at evaluating uncertainty, and yet we still routinely underestimate it. And I'll try to show you some examples of that. I do appreciate that I'm sympathetic to the problem in politics, that it really is the hardest thing to say, I do not know. But I think it's something that we have to learn. And instead of saying, I do know, or I really need to know this, we must, I think, accustom ourselves to saying that I can't know this. And therefore, how do we manage when I can't know this? Now, as I said, my background is a journalist, and it may surprise you to know that we do have epistemological principles in journalism, although they're rather crude, as you can see. And when I was training as a journalist, this is actually what I was taught. They told me to do this. They said you must simplify and you must amplify. Now, possibly you would recognize that from some of the racier newspapers that Britain is well known for. But I think it also applies to the serious newspapers, the Times, the BBC, the Guardian, as a broadcaster, the BBC. I will try to compare some of the behavior in those areas where I think we see this simplification and amplification with research practices in universities and elsewhere, and I'll hope that you find the comparison instructive. So my first example is possibly one that you'll have some experience of in Pakistan, which is the problem of air quality. Now, the Guardian newspaper, one of our principal serious broadsheet newspapers, has been featuring this problem for a number of years now. The Times newspaper, another serious broadsheet newspaper, has been campaigning for clean air for all. And we have a sequence of stories, some of them international, where I think the problem is probably genuine and severe in some parts of the world, but also for the UK, the United Kingdom. Now, what these stories say is that the problem is severe. They frequently tell us how many people are probably dying. We see cases of individuals with asthma who've been rushed to hospital. We're shown research about how dangerous this level of air quality is, how often it breaches international standards, and so on. What we do not see, I think I've noticed this once in perhaps 10 years, although the data has been available for a very long time, we do not see the trends in air pollution. Now, you would think where we're talking about the seriousness of a problem, whether it is becoming more or less serious ought to be a fundamental part of the way that we talk about it. And yet we do not. And that, I think, is because the story is allowed to be presumed. And that's part of what I think of as a tendency to eliminate any questioning areas, any lines of inquiry that might cause people to reflect on the degree of seriousness, because we want to impress on people that this is very serious indeed, that it's a very dangerous thing, that action is required immediately. Now, actually, I believe that we could do more, and I believe that it is a serious thing, but I do not understand how we can call ourselves serious and get away without reporting the trends, but we do. Now, on the other side of the graph, you can see those trends, where we take a large number of air pollutants. You can see the one that plunges very dramatically, which popped up above the line, is, I think that's in the mid-1990s. I think that's the components of aerosols, which were affected by the Montreal Protocol and subsequently collapsed. But you can see actually that all of those lines crash. I mean, they just slide down to an extraordinary degree. If you take the particulates, the PM2.5 and PM10, the values there, you can see that they were something like, when I was a child, something like 5 times higher than they are presently. Now, again, we're often told how many people are dying because of air pollution in our country and around the world. Nobody has ever reported how many people have been saved by that trend. But it would have been extraordinary. The progress we have made there is absolutely dramatic. This also applies to metals in the atmosphere. It's also true in the United States, where I think the assumption is that environmental controls are extremely lax, or at least the assumption in the UK is that United States air controls are extremely lax. In fact, whether they're lax or not, air quality is also improved in the United States. And the improvement, it really is dramatic. I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples of this at the roadside. So you might say, well, this is some kind of countrywide average. What about right beside the roads where the traffic is heavy? At the roadside, the mean number of hours where PM10 concentrations exceeded the moderate threshold, now this is one way of measuring how bad it is, for a monitoring site, decreased by 95% between 1997 and 2018 to the fewest hours in the time series. At urban background sites, so not right by the road, but in cities and elsewhere and other built up areas, the number of hours where PM10 concentrations exceeded the moderate threshold decreased by 97%. Our public is wholly unaware of this. And that's really because we know what the story is supposed to be, we know what we're supposed to think. This data is not perfect, of course. There are many objections you can make to it, but if there's anything fundamentally wrong with it, I don't know really what it is. I repeat, it is very likely that some people are dying early because of air pollution. I think we could improve, but the general narrative is a simplifying, hyperbolic one that everything is terrible, and the implication is that it's getting worse, which is absolutely the contrary of the truth. I'll give you another example of the kind of simplification and hype that occurs. Actually, let's go back to that one briefly, because I did promise I'd try and draw some parallels with the research world. So let's, I'll take the question in just a moment. Let's just flip across to King's College London. Consider King's College London, which is the source of much of the data that's reported in the newspapers. They do a great deal of research on air quality in London and elsewhere. Is any of this present in King's College London research or on their website? Is there any emphasis, any attention given to these trends, any calculations of the lives saved? You might find it if you look very hard, but you'll find no prominence for it. So is there really any difference, in my view, between the hype that we see in the newspapers and the media and the BBC and elsewhere around this question, the simplification? I don't think so. I think King's College London, The Guardian, The Times, the BBC are all very similar in their treatment of this problem. Another example, obesity. We have a problem with obesity. Again, I readily concede that there is a problem. It's not even a concession. I'd assert it. There is a problem. How is it reported? Well, you can see here again, the Times, as I say, a serious paper. It likes to think of itself as a moderate paper, not an extreme paper. And it reports here that 40% of primary leavers are to be overweight within 5 years. And you see on the other side, there's a chart with that forecast for the percentage of 10 to 11-year-olds who are going to be obese or overweight, with some historical data there as well. And it's sourced to Public Health England, which is our independent, objective, we'll see about that in a moment, science-led faculty for studying the weight, trends in weight, health, public health of the general population. How did they arrive at this, this forecast? Well, there was some historical data, which you see at the top, and there was some projected data, which you can see at the bottom. But actually, there was more than one set of projected figures. There were confidence intervals, higher and lower. So there was some uncertainty, as you would expect. They're looking into the future. How could they know for sure? They put uncertainty around this. What did the Times do? Well, it quickly moved along to the higher range of the uncertainty and pretended the other estimates didn't exist, and then put that into a chart where you can see it rises to about 30%, 38%, but 38% is an ugly number. Let's just round it up a little bit further to 40% to put that into our headline. And you can see the process of the elimination of any uncertainty, the simplification, and the exaggeration of the probable trend. Everything is designed to ratchet up the sense of fear, confidence in the projection, and the enormity of the problem. But I want to focus a little on, so we see that, I want to focus a little on the those early estimates and bring us back to the point that this is Public Health England. So we'll move away from the journalism, because these trend data so far, they're not forecasts. There's not supposed to be very much uncertainty around this trend data. It's a very, very large survey. Something like 96, 97% of the whole child population is included in this survey. So this is historical data. But if we go to Public Health England, you'll see here there that this is just obesity, and this is what moves that line. The overweight numbers don't move the line very much, the obesity numbers do. You can see the red line there for the historical data and the blue line there are very similar in shape. And again, I'm going to highlight those early values, the first 3 years of what we call the National Child Measurement Program, where we weigh just about every child in the country. Now, in those early years, there's a little caveat. Again, you have to look very closely on the website. In fact, it's not available on the website. You have to go back to some of the printed materials that were produced in those early years. I found this on a PDF. You can't get an Excel spreadsheet with this data on, but it says in there, it produces this caveat. Comparisons are not possible in the first years of the National Child Measurement Program, as obesity prevalence was an underestimate due to low participation. In other words, they didn't have 96 or 97% at that point. Some people didn't take part. Who doesn't want to take part in a survey of obesity? Well, I think you can answer that question. I think we probably know who doesn't take part. So this is why they think the early estimates were probably underestimates. And if they did at that time, although they don't talk about it anymore, they did at the time attempt to correct for that underrepresentation of obese people in those early numbers. And they said, actually, we think it should probably be up around there. We don't have the data for it. This is, as I say, an estimate. But that's where we think it ought to be. So let's take that correction back to our media report of the trend, and let's try and pop it in there. And let's also add another year, because since then we've had another year of data. Now you can see that the data that is probably more an accurate representation of what's really been going on to childhood obesity and overweight. And you can see how the forecast compares with that trend. And I think you would be very reasonable in saying to you, where on earth does that forecast come from? Now, this is a process, I think, which is hyperbolic, as I say. It's amplified, and it's simplified because we've taken out the uncertainty and we've ignored the caveats around the initial values to produce a story which is, this thing is on a railroad to hell. Now, again, there's a problem. It's probably going up. But that's not good enough. It has to be the apocalypse tomorrow. This is the way that we talk about these things. We have to have a degree of either terror or complete certainty, one way or the other, that things are either going to be wonderful or going to be terrible, you know, and here we are. And now, but there's another question as well. How sure are we, forget the trend for a moment, how sure are we of the absolute values? Now, I say that survey is a very large survey of almost every child in the country, but we don't do that for adults. For adult obesity, we rely on another survey called the Health Survey for England, which is smaller. But again, it's been run for very many years. So you might say, and it's probably big enough, you know, we're looking at about 2,000, 3,000 people, I believe. It's probably big enough. And it's been repeated, and the values don't change a great deal from year to year. So it's probably not bad. Uncertain, of course, but probably not bad. And these are what we think the obesity trends are for men and women in different ages. If we put the childhood survey, if we superimpose that on this, it suggests that 10 to 11-year-olds lose weight at an astonishing rate between the ages of 10 and 11 and 16 to 24, which is contrary to the trend for all other age groups until you become quite old. The trend in all other age groups is for rising obesity. Here we see it decline. Is that plausible? I don't think so. One of those sets of figures is very wrong. The overall number for obesity and overweight put together, you'll see, is roughly comparable between 10 and 11 and 16 and 24, but you would expect it to rise sharply if these trends can be relied on. So here we are with an extremely well-run survey, producing data which is probably in one way quite reliable in that the trends are probably reasonably clear, if only we'd be honest about what they really were. But where the absolute value is subject to some kind of definitional wrinkle in the way that we set up the inquiry, which makes us uncertain about whether the number of people obese is, I don't know, half that. I think that's plausible at that age of 10 to 11-year-olds. Curiously, Public Health England claims that it's not trying to persuade anybody. There's no hidden motive in this. All they're trying to do is give people information, they say. Although if you go to the Public Health England website, you find that it's rather proud of its persuasive capabilities. So there is, I think, a slightly deluded notion about the objectivity, whether they're there to persuade, quite how far they're allowed to go when they're persuading, which means that both in the media and in the research world, our information is corrupted. I think I would put it like that. I don't think the people who do it are bad people. I don't think their motives are wrong. I think they think they're doing good things. I don't really think they're lying. I wouldn't use that word, but I do think it's misleading. And I think it's a result of an exaggerated sense of what we can plausibly say, what it's fair to say. The story, they think, I believe they would say that the story is true enough or something of that sort. I don't really know. I'm rather puzzled by the psychology of the whole thing. I'll move on to another example. Let me tell you a story about the marmocrebs. This features in the book, so it'll be familiar to one or two people. The marmocrebs are an extraordinary creature. They're a species of crayfish. You can see they're a very little marmocreb and one once it reaches maturity. Now, the story really starts in Germany in the mid-1990s because they were fashionable in aquaria. People like to own these things. Aquarium enthusiasts in Germany, if you can imagine that group, it's rather an obscure group to focus on, but just for a moment, picture yourselves all these people who love their aquaria and their fish, and they're keeping marmocrebs. And then they notice something. They notice something very puzzling, that they can think they've had a female marmocreb in their tank, and only one, and yet it lays eggs, and they hatch. And then they notice that all the eggs seem to be females, but the females seem to lay more eggs, and they hatch. And so they start saying to themselves, well, how are these things breeding? Where are the males? Now, eventually, the research world gets hold of this and says, well, this is fascinating. You know, are these things actually parthenogenetic? Are they generating without sexual reproduction? And they decide that, yes, this is correct. Now, that's an extraordinary thing because there's no evidence that these things exist in the wild. They seem to have spontaneously become parthenogenetic in the lab, in the aquarium. Somewhere, one crayfish had some kind of mutation, which meant that it did not have to breed, that it could clone itself. And that's what all these animals are, they're clones. Now, that's terrifically exciting to research because if you have a cloned creature, you can start to ask some extremely interesting questions. You can say, for example, well, if we can hold the genetics constant, then any change in these creatures must be due to the environment. The genes are all the same. It can't be the genes. It must be the environment if there are any differences between them. But they went a step further. They standardized the environment as well. They did everything humanly possible to try to make sure these things grew up in the same environment. They even separated some of them. They put them in separate tanks, but the water temperature was the same. The water was the same in its constituency. They even had the same people examine them in the same kind of plastic gloves, you know, every time to try to, they fed every single marmocreb to excess. So there was no competition for food, even when they were brought together all together. Nothing, as far as was humanly ascertainable, was different in any respect about these creatures. So what did they look like? Well, within one batch of eggs, there was a difference of weight by a factor of 20 times, 20 times. One marmocreb's genetically identical, environmentally identical, was 20 times the weight of another. Every single marmocreb's had a different pattern on its carapace, on its shell, like fingerprints. They have feeding parts at the front of the mouth, like teeth. They're very flexible, but they're essentially their feeding instruments. They have different numbers of these teeth, if I can call them that. They're behaviorally different. Some of them are loners when you bring them together, some of them like a crowd. Some are subservient, some are dominant. Their lifespan varies by a factor of 3, and yet they're the same. Now, this is the principle really of the hidden half, which is moving us on a little way from kind of data, and it's very much in the research world. But again, the point is to highlight the way that we talk about these things, where I think we all, certainly in my case, believed that either it was genetics that caused differences between species and between people, or it was the environment. This was it, exclusively. Yet here we're observing, and this is where it touches again on the data, we're observing another large area of uncertainty, which we're just not talking about. Because there's clearly some other factor which influences the development, which is neither, strictly speaking, genetic nor environmental. Now, this is news to almost everybody I talk to about it. They say, well, what do you mean? There isn't anything else. What could that be? Well, by some estimates, if you try to determine the portion of the difference between people, so this is not the fact that they're people, because without genes, I wouldn't be a person, but without environment, I wouldn't be a person either. So you could say that they're both 100% necessary. But when you look at the differences between people, how much of those differences are the consequence of genetics or of environment? And how much of the consequence of this third factor, this chance factor that we don't really know how to describe? Well, on some measures, about half the difference between people is this unknown third factor, which causes enormous uncertainty and about which almost nobody ever talks or is even aware. The most plausible of the explanations, I think, for this is that there is something during the developmental process in utero, which is, we might as well call chance, which is that although the genetics gives us a recipe for making a human, actually baking that cake is very variable. And the rules are sometimes not followed by the body. There are chance effects which cause the brain in particular to develop in particular ways, the neuronal pathways to do things which are unpredictable. And so you get this big variety of outcomes. There's a question there. I'll give way. Let me just hand over for the question for a moment. I see a raised hand. I think you're on mute, sir.
Sorry, I'm saying don't worry, we'll take the questions at the end. Just go ahead and finish. We'll take questions later.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so there is this other thing, as it's been called, this other thing, this black developmental box, which we just don't really understand and don't really talk about, which makes an enormous difference to the outcomes, where the usual titans of influence, you know, the genes and the environment, we've argued about these things for ages, and we've slaughtered each other because of them. You know, we have ridiculous confidence that one or other of these explanations is the true one, when in fact there is a very large amount of uncertainty which we don't talk about at all. And I think that's characteristic of many areas of human inquiry. Now, when my book was reviewed by Unheard, which is a website by Sam Leith, and he said most lay people didn't know we didn't know about this thing. We probably thought it was all between genes and environment, not environment, genes, and this other thing, as he puts it. When you read the popular accounts of people's research, so Robert Plomin is one of the leading genetic researchers in the world, I think it's fair to say that. He uses the phrase blueprint for the genetic influence. If you look at accounts that emphasize the environment, they use the phrase blueprint. But even Robert Plomin will concede that there is this significant area, this other thing, and what he says about it is that these influences are mostly random, unsystematic, unstable, which means we can't do much about them. It means more than that. It means we can't predict them. We can't even explain them after we've seen them, after the fact. Now, I quite like metaphors, images, as a way of trying to describe the way that our belief that we have robust understanding of how things work can often be frustrated. And this is one of my favorites. This is what we call a chicane, a cycling chicane. You put them, I'm not sure if you have them, probably, I wouldn't be surprised. Put them on footpaths to slow down people on bikes or skateboards or scooters or whatever. You try and make them dodge through the metal barriers, and this slows them down so that they're safer to pedestrians. And these things have been well tried, you know, we've researched them, we know that they work in some sense. And so we say we've sussed this, we understand the mechanisms and all the rest of it. And yet, there is this other thing, this sort of unpredictable, unintended consequence, whatever you want to call it, this fact which you know, applies in some contexts but not others, which we think, we've studied this. You've studied in one context, in one place, with just making one set of assumptions, you know, which are very, very easily frustrated as soon as you get it out into the real world. So I use this as a slight metaphor for the way that we can believe our understanding is firm, robust, but that we can extremely easily be surprised. And I want to offer you a quotation from James George Fraser, who was about 100 years ago, who was an anthropologist. He said, "The propensity to excessive simplification is natural to the mind of man, since it's the only way, really. And that necessarily implies the neglect of a multitude of particulars, the only way that we can stretch our puny faculties so as to embrace a minute portion of the illimitable vastness of the universe." It's rather grand as a statement, but I think it captures something of the truth. There is an infinity of possible complications, as there is with the marmocrebs, as there is with any sort of data, I think, which we have to be wary of. And to accept that they are, it means that measuring simple things, accounting for simple things, describing causation of apparently simple things where we have confidence is nevertheless often highly unreliable. Now, I'll give you some economic examples because I'm aware that I'm talking to the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics. Now, you were saying, sir, that some of your data is questionable. We have great confidence in our data. We have the Office for National Statistics, which is a highly reputable organization. I think its methodology is overwhelmingly good. And we have regular authoritative estimates of key indicators like unemployment, for example, which come from the ONS. And here we see one reported by the BBC telling us that unemployment fell by 3,000 to 1.44 million. And that's actually what the ONS itself said. But if you look into the detail, the methodological detail, it's right down there, number 17, quality and methodology in the ONS report. And this is how it used to be presented very recently, until very recently. And you look into that quality and methodology and you focus on that 3,000 change in unemployment. If you focus on it at all, in reading it, you probably just say, oh, it's down. it fell. That's good. And then we take a little look at that section 17, and it says, although there was a small fall, the 95% confidence interval is plus or minus 77,000. So our fall of 3,000 could have been an increase of 74,000. That's the degree of uncertainty around unemployment. It's never reported by our mainstream media. It's buried by our National Statistics Office. Quite often, the absolute change in unemployment is far smaller than the degree of uncertainty around it. Let's take GDP. Again, we're pretty confident about our numbers on GDP by and large. We track them very carefully. When something happens like Brexit, we follow them slavishly. Absolutely, the smallest changes are seized on as evidence that Brexit has been good for us or bad for us or whatever. Here we have a story, UK economic growth edges slightly higher. The Office for National Statistics said the economy expanded by 0.3% in the quarter. Now, this is interesting, up from 0.2% in the previous 3 months. So again, things are getting better, is the essential story here. Things are getting better. One way that you can gauge the uncertainty around economic data of this kind, GDP, is to look at how it's revised. Because it does get revised as more data comes in. We don't have complete data at the beginning. It's made on a sample of something like 40% of businesses, this initial estimate. So how much is it revised? Because the degree of those revisions gives us a clue about how confident we should have been with our first estimate. Well, I'll give you some examples. This is Q2 in 2008, when the global financial crisis hit. Initially, we didn't know that it had hit. And we said that we thought the economy had grown by 0.2. That's the first value shown on July 2008. As the years have passed, our estimate of what happened in that quarter, in the second quarter of 2008, has changed. Well, changed is something of a gentle way of putting it. It's been an absolute roller coaster, what we think happened. Our revisions have been enormous. You know, to change our estimate by more than a whole percentage point about what one quarter's growth was. This is just in one quarter. This is not annualized. This is just one quarter. Is extraordinary for the UK. Well, you would think it's extraordinary. Actually, it's not that extraordinary. It happens quite often. Here's another quarter. This was Q1 of 2002, when we thought we were going into what we called a double dip, the second phase of a recession following the big recession in 2008-9. We thought the economy had contracted by 0.2. Subsequently, in the months following, we were pretty sure about that. In fact, we thought it was slightly worse than 0.2. We said 0.3. And then over the years, we've decided, no, it didn't contract by 0.2 or 0.3. Eventually, we decided it was growing. The latest belief about what was happening in that quarter is that it was growing extremely fast by UK standards. 0.6 is a very fast rate of growth for the United Kingdom. How could we be so wrong? Well, that's another question. Why were we so confident? The question I'm interested in, I don't think there's a good answer to that. I think we had no grounds for our confidence whatsoever. And we should somehow have found a way of putting some confidence intervals around that GDP estimate, but we haven't yet. We're now talking about it, and I'll mention that in a moment, but we haven't done it yet. Here's another example, 2005. According to the data, I don't know what this tells us about what was really going on in the real world. I mean, you know, your guess is probably as good as mine. I think it's probably getting somewhere approximately correct, but I don't know, because there were also some technical adjustments in there, as they call them, that have happened over the years. So the initial estimate of 0.4, the current estimate, something like, what is that, 1.1, 1.2? That's Chinese rates of growth, or possibly Pakistan rates of growth. I'm not sure. If you see 4 or 5% a year, we don't see that kind of thing. We typically see about 2 in a year. You know, it looks as if we're getting 1% in 3 months. double the normal rate of growth. Now, at the time, the Bank of England cut interest rates because it thought growth was looking as if it was trending down and we were possibly going into a bit of a slump. We weren't going to anything like even a moderate phase of growth. We were booming. We got it completely the wrong way around. If you take that 2005 as a whole year, you see the month one estimates and the latest estimates, they really do. The latest estimates do suggest about 5% over the whole year. Absolutely extraordinary. I haven't seen anything like that for I don't know how long. Now, you say, well, how often does this happen? It happens a lot. These are the revisions up or down from the first estimate to the final estimate. And you can see that a great many of them, the revision is 0.5, 0.6 in many cases, 0.34 is very common. As I say, the ONS has started to think about this a little more in a couple of reports recently about how they communicate the uncertainty around these data. And so at that time, I made a radio program for the BBC looking at the uncertainty around GDP. And I interviewed a couple of people who'd been influential in the research on this question. And Anna Galvao, who's Professor of Economic Modelling at Warwick Business School, told me this. Given the data that we see, say we look at the data and it suggests that the economy is growing by about 1% or something, it could actually be growing at around 3%, or it could be behaving at around 0.5%. That's the span of uncertainty. And I asked her, I want to be sure I've understood that, because it suggests to me we can't tell the difference between something that's almost stagnant and something that's a boom. And she said, yeah, that's about right. We can't. Now, forgive me, I haven't studied the quality of the Pakistan data on GDP, but as I say, we like to think that ours is quite good. So this is according to the ONS. I interviewed Rob Kent-Smith as well, who is one of the people working at the ONS on this question of the uncertainty around the estimates. He said, take one example. Let's look at Q4 GDP in 2016. The first estimate was 0.6%. The upper confidence interval was 1%. The low was 0.2. That's a spread overall of 0.8. You can see how large that spread is around the central estimate. Now, it's worse than that, because this is only a 2/3 confidence interval. There's a 1/3 chance the final value will be outside even that. The Bank of England does show uncertainty around its GDP. This is one of the it shows this is in its forecasting. And you can see there are these different bands expressing different probabilities about where they think the GDP will finish up. But I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side of the graph, which shows the ONS data. Because there are still large uncertainty intervals around the historic data, even several years previously. Now, that's what the Bank of England thinks of the quality of the ONS's data, the uncertainty around it. But does the ONS at the moment publish these measures of uncertainty? Do the newspapers refer to them? Does the government refer to them? Do the pundits and the analysts and the business consultants and the business lobbies and bodies and representative groups refer to them? No. The uncertainty is not really acknowledged. Forecasting uncertainty is better. That is more acknowledged. Historical uncertainty, present day uncertainty, not nearly so much. I'm going to skip over the next example because I'm aware we're a little short of time and just move on to COVID. If I try and finish in about 10 minutes, is that okay? And then leave some time for questions. Is that reasonable?
That's fine. You can take your time. Don't worry.
Okay, thank you. With COVID, there are clearly enormous uncertainties. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know whether it was going to be like the original SARS or like some of the other infectious diseases that have sprung up and very quickly evaporated. We didn't know if it would flare up, what it would do, really. And there was quantitative uncertainty around some of the estimates about what would happen if it was infectious. So you can take a couple of scenarios there where you say each case infects 2 people in a week, or maybe each case infects 3 others in 5 days, slightly tweak the parameters. And the results are that one scenario gives you 2,000 cases, the second gives you 10 million. That range, I think, is staggering, and we did not know whether we were facing scenario A or scenario B until some way into the epidemic, I think, before we began to take sense of what the numbers were. I want to tell you a little story which doesn't appear in the book, because again, I think the conversation around COVID is very often quite strident, quite confident. People's prescriptions about what's necessary for us to do are very often intolerant, I think, of questioning. I've been helping, I was involved in a series of seminars which have been taking place in the UK called COVID Known Unknowns, which we organised in association with the British Medical Journal. I've been loosely associated with kicking that off. One of the reasons we did that was to try to improve the tone of the conversation just by introducing some uncertainty. Just by saying, you know, actually, we're not sure, and trying to make people a little more tolerant of one another's different takes on the data and so on. Now, the story I want to tell is about a chap called Major Greenwood. That's not a military rank, that was actually his name, Major. Experimental epidemiology, which was something in the interwar period following the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu, global epidemic in 1918, 1919. The estimates for how many it killed vary between about 20 and 100 million. I think a common one is something like 50 million. The world population was much smaller in that time, of course. The experimental epidemiologists were horrified by that experience, deeply marked their feelings of irrelevance. They felt there was nothing they could do. They stood idly by and watched the disease run its course. And they said, effectively, they said never again. And what they determined to do was to bring together the 2 existing strands of research on disease, one at the small scale, the microscopic scale, where bacteriology made enormous strides in recent decades. There were several vaccinations around for infectious diseases at this point, so understanding the pathogen was clearly a potentially rewarding source of inquiry. The other strand of inquiry into infectious diseases at the large scale, epidemiology, where you look at the up and down trends in overall mortality and so on, and you try to do some causal relationships with other factors. Now, the way they brought those together was by studying mice in the laboratory and basically experimentally manipulating epidemics in the lab. Several hundred, sometimes a few thousand mice, sometimes 1,000 mice at a time, where they were precisely calibrating many, many variables: the diet, the proximity of the mice, the initial dose, what we would now call the load, the viral load. And they did this repeatedly with, I say, there was another group in the United States doing the same thing, another one in Germany, and then in Australia. So around the world, I think something like 500,000 mice they got through. And they autopsied every single one of them, looking at tissue samples and the rest. Absolutely, it took them 20 years. They devoted 20 years of their working lives. It was, for all of them, the biggest commitment any of them made in their professional careers. I don't think, even today, we would have been able to do it better, to try to isolate experimentally the causal influences on the ups and downs of an epidemic. What makes it go up? What makes it go down precisely? Why does it vary in the way that it does? Sometimes goes away, sometimes comes back. At the end, they could put 2, as far as they could tell, identical groups of mice into cages where all the conditions are the same, echoes of the marmor krebs here. And they could introduce what they thought was the same degree of infectious load. And in one of those groups, the epidemic would roar away, and in the other, it would disappear. In one group, you'd see 70% mortality. In the other group, you'd see none. They could not explain this. It's quite sobering that after 20 years and 500,000 mice and rigorously controlled experimental conditions, you can't find what makes an epidemic go up and down. But I think there's still some truth in that. We have some broad understanding that if you limit people's exposure, that helps. Lockdowns and the like. But I don't think we really understand all the dynamics. Now, I'll give you, so that was the way they set out to do it. And this is my friend, George Davis Smith, who says, you know, you could vary things like vary nutritional status, vary how they're housed, vary the population size, density. You're actually doing things in experimental conditions, and yet they could not tell. One of the participants, Major Green, would say the result of injecting a fixed dose of a bacteria could depend on any of the following: the reaction of the gastric juice, the interval since the last meal, the rate of emptying the stomach, and so on, the temporary condition of the blood plasma or leukocytes, the rate of lymph flow, the state of the cells in the sinuses through which the bacteria happen to pass, and so on ad infinitum. To me, it is no surprise that our estimates of the future course of COVID, these are from the United States Center for Disease Control, show an enormous range. I think that's a proper representation of the uncertainty. I feel deeply uncertain still about what it's going to do. Again, what's interesting, I think, is that if you look at some of the estimates of the fundamental variables involved in the epidemic, so this is SPI-M. So this is the advisory group which, for our government, of experts, which concentrates on the modeling of the disease. And here you can see their estimates of the R number at a particular point in the epidemic. So the R number is how many people you're likely to infect if you are infected. It's the volume of transmission. Let's think of it like that. What's interesting here, I think, is how many of these estimates, even with uncertainty around them, because you can see there are some error bars around this or confidence intervals, do not overlap. In other words, what these modelers are conceding is that there's probably some uncertainty about the data, although let's remember that they are all using the same data. They're all using the same data. But they're coming to a judgment which I think suggests that they believe their model is true. What they're not showing us, therefore, is the modular uncertainty. The fact that all models are potentially wrong. As we know, George Box, I think it's Box, said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think there's a counterpart to that, which is all models are wrong, but some are dangerous. You don't always know which kind of model you've got. But I think the fact that these even the confidence intervals don't overlap is a suggestion, I think, of acute overconfidence. Once again, I want to pay tribute to the people involved. I think they are conscientious. They have far more expertise than I do. They're far cleverer than I am. And yet, possibly it's related to their expertise and authority that they feel they have to state their estimates with more confidence than they really ought. I don't know. I'm going to stop there and leave you with a couple of quotations. This one, which I use in the book, "The Great Menace to Progress is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge." The kind of confidence that attends that illusion, I think, can be damaging. If you nail all your judgment to one view of the world, you find it harder to change. You bet the whole ranch on one outcome. It makes us extraordinarily vulnerable, this kind of confidence. James George Fraser, who worried about simplification earlier, he said to correct it partially, you can't do it entirely. Here are some here are some things we can do. We must endeavour to broaden our views by taking account of a wide range of facts and possibilities. And when we have done so to the utmost of our power, we must still remember that from the very nature of things, our ideas fall immeasurably short of reality. Another one that I quite like from somebody who runs a lab in the US, I encourage an increasing sense of unease. I rather like that. I rather like that as an antidote to confidence. If we could all feel a little more uneasy, a little more humble, I think, about our ability to ascertain what's really going on in the world, I think it would do us all a great deal of good. I think it would improve our research. I think it would improve the tone of our conversation between us. And so I commend that, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions, but once again, deeply grateful for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very good, very interesting indeed. Although I must say I'm a little uneasy now because, you know, we've been brought up to believe in the scientific method, and we've been brought up to, especially in recent times, to think about evidence-based policy. And there's a whole variety of Nobel Prize winners, World Bank, IMF, international agencies, UNDP. I mean, the whole international architecture is now spewing out data like there's no tomorrow. We are spewing out more data. There's a corruption index. There's a good governance index. There's a rule of law index. There's this, that. So we are inundated, and you must understand our position where we come from, sitting in the corner of the world, with Afghanistan and so many things around us, and with very little human capital, and not the same thing as your Office of National Statistics. We are told that we shouldn't move a step without evidence. Now you've kind of made me feel very uneasy about evidence. The second thing that we are told as we go into fund program after fund program, we do a lot of work with the IMF. In fact, we work with the IMF because they fund us, and you know we have to respond to them. We are talking to them even now. They give us predictions of the economy, and we treat them like the Bible. And in those predictions, they never give us a confidence interval. In fact, nobody ever gives us a confidence interval, and we know nothing about confidence intervals. Our GDP statistics, I once tried to do a simple calculation, probably has a confidence interval larger than the GDP itself. It's a huge confidence interval. So quite frankly, we can never distinguish from zero, but nevertheless, we argue about GDP, like whether it's 0.1%, 3.2 to 3.3, we argue very fanatically. It's such a big difference. And, you know, the government even feels that the policy has succeeded because it's gone up from 3.2 to 3.3. So we are very, very, very clear that we have extreme degree of accuracy in our measurement. Then along comes the World Bank and gives us poverty numbers. And the one thing that I've noticed about poverty numbers, and you mentioned in your book too, that there are no confidence intervals around poverty numbers. In fact, nobody knows how to calculate an interval around the poverty numbers. So poverty numbers always come in exact. It's 33.7 now. Last year it was 32.2. So I mean, a big difference between 32.2. So we live in data, and we admire data, and we work with it. And evidence-based policy is what we try and do. We go to the meeting room and we have evidence-based policy. So how are you going to shade that now? How are you going to make us feel uneasy about evidence-based policy? And how do you do that in UK? We think that you're very scientific and you do your policy on the basis of hard science and good econometric models and everything. So where do you stand on that?
Well, I think you put it very well. There's clearly a problem here. I am not a cynic about data. I am a skeptic. And I think there's a difference. A cynic about data simply, you know, you throw up your hands. You say, oh, I don't know, you can't believe any of it. And I think that's resignation. I think it's destructive. And when you do throw up your hands, you don't actually leave with an open mind. You just revert to one of your old prejudices and presumptions. I think that's what happens with cynicism. Skepticism is a terrifically hard thing to do. I think it means that you have to put yourself in a state of mind which is almost a betting mentality, where you are acutely aware of the fallibility of your information, but you still have to make decisions. You can't walk away like the cynic. You have to make decisions. We all have to make decisions. And how do we do that? We do it on the basis of the best available evidence, but we must do it, I think, with an acute sense of the fragility of that evidence. How frail a read a lot of this data really is, how these well, you know, the old joke about forecasting, you must never forecast about the future. I think what we ought to demand are sensitivity analyses. How much does your estimate depend on particular characteristics in the model? If you tweak them a bit, what happens? We ought to demand confidence intervals from the people who give us this kind of information. We ought to say, how reliable is this data? How reliable has it been in the past? We ought to demand from our policymakers the capacity to be flexible when we discover that the numbers weren't the way they seemed, so that we do not bet the whole ranch on one policy option, that we are aware that things might not turn out the way that we thought they would if we pursued this. We are aware that, you know, the cycle chicane might leave this large problem, which means that everybody goes around it instead of going through it. You know, this kind of sensitivity to our epistemological weakness, our basic epistemological weakness. So it's not that we ought to reject this data. I think the data is as good as you know, we get the best data we can, but I think two things. One, we would get better data if we worried more about its inaccuracies and its fragility. If we simply say, oh, it's fine, it's good, it's always been good, you know, we do these, then we will not inquire about where it could be improved. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that we treat it with a sense of its fallibility. Now, it doesn't mean, as I say, that you can stop taking decisions. You just have to carry on with the decisions, and you have to make them on the basis of the best information available. So for me, I think a betting framework, I know betting is perhaps not a great analogy in some parts of the world, but for me, a betting framework is quite a useful one. So how much belief do I have in this evidence, this data, compared with that evidence or that data? Well, if you don't have very much belief at all, then you tread really carefully. If you have a lot, you're perhaps a little more bold. So I think that's how it plays out for me. That's the practical consequence. But I do emphasize that it doesn't mean you can't run away from the problem altogether. We still have to run the country. We still have to make decisions in our personal lives as well and in our businesses. But there's a world of a difference from saying, I know, and I kind of think, possibly, maybe. And, you know, the strategies that follow from those two attitudes are radically different.
Michael, there's another issue that I think I'd like to raise here. Despite data being available, and also a huge ability that has expanded over time to analyze data, use artificial intelligence and all kinds of things, we do tend to, I mean, of course, we have to admit, we do have a lot more information, not just data, a lot more information, a lot more evidence, which goes beyond data. Interpretation of data too, we have on many things. And we, you know, for example, traffic accidents or epidemiology, it's lots of regularities that we do observe. But there are 2 points that come out which are also important. One is, have we transcended the ability to be biased about data? And I wonder about it from both the research side as well as the popularity side. For example, if I look at the Republican versus Democratic debate in the US, despite all the data in the studies, the difference remains absolutely intact. And their interpretation of the same evidence is absolutely divisive. And people, you know, there's no way that you can come together, even though the data and the evidence is there. The second thing is, researchers also, we've seen, do tend to validate hypotheses according to their own biases. They don't clearly want to show the alternative hypothesis if it shows up. So this goes back to maybe Kahneman, etc., that maybe the confirmation bias in us is so strong that we really can't be objective about data at all. How do you see that?
Well, I defer to Daniel Kahneman on this one. I mean, psychology is not quite so much, but I think you make a good point. And thank you, by the way, for saying that yes, there are some large irregularities. I absolutely agree with that. There are some areas where I think the data is conclusive or conclusive enough, and we can act with quite a lot of confidence. I just think that those are fewer, they're rarer than I think probably we tend to assume. The bias problem, I agree. I don't think it's true of everyone. I think there are some more flexible minds. So I have a rough rule of thumb, which is that I respect people who respect uncertainty. I have more confidence that the biases will not be the determining factor if people are willing to say at some point, I do not know, I'm unsure, our data is unreliable, whatever it is, you know, I hesitate before coming to a conclusion. And that's simply a way of distinguishing those people who I feel who are driving a conclusion from almost before the data is gathered to those people who are perhaps saying, well, let's at least see what the evidence shows us before we come to one. So if I feel that my sources are respecting uncertainty, then I am more likely to respect them. That's something that I try to suggest to journalists as well. Now, it's very tempting to invite onto your program, your TV or radio program, or into your columns, those people who have the most strident opinions, who seem to have, you know, most confidence in their own voice. I don't find those people the most interesting, because I don't think they have open minds. I don't think they're really interested in the data. They're interested in selling you something. So do I see people who want to persuade me, or people who want to inform me? People who are fast to a conclusion, or people who are slow? These are the kind of distinctions that I try to make when I'm evaluating evidence. I
Thank
can
you.
see other hands raised around the room.
There are Farouk Iqbal. Farouk, are you there?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Can,
we
yeah.
can.
Yes. All right. So I wonder if you could be a little more positive based on the following observation. The observation is that confidence bands around any statistic can be narrowed with the collection of more observations. So if you have many more observations around some activity, the confidence bands can be narrowed. Second, we are now in an increasingly data-rich world, meaning it is now technically possible to collect millions of observations on some economic activities, where previously we could only do that, let's say, for thousands of activities. And by that, I mean activities that can be recorded through social media, internet, mobility data, Google, and all of that. So given these two things, the fact that more observations should help narrow the band, and that we are now technically capable of generating orders of magnitude of observations more than before, would this not give you more, what's the word, confidence about statistics in the future?
I think it's a good question. Thank you. My answer is yes, a little, but possibly not quite as much as some others would feel. And I think if we come back to the example of GDP, we're able to sample within 18 months to 2 years, just about every business transaction that's occurred in the whole of the United Kingdom. And still, you see this uncertainty. Now, in some ways, you could say that the uncertainty is not very large. You could say that we're arguing about 0.3, 0.4% of the entire activity. This is actually quite a small degree of confidence. But it's relating that to the way that we talk about our decision-making. Well over 99% of the economy is probably assessed accurately enough, but it's the margin of change that we obsess over. And so you have to relate the accuracy to the question you're trying to answer. If you simply want to have a ballpark sense of roughly how the economy has developed over the last 100 years, I think actually the data is pretty good. In the United Kingdom, we've grown about 4 times since the war. I think that's quite a robust ballpark statement. It's just when we get down to, when we start saying, 0.2 or 0.3, 0.3 or 0.4, and you say, okay, we have all this data, we have this enormous quantity of data, surely, well, you can't answer that question as precisely as you want to. And I think that's the thing we have to do. We have to align the question with the kind of data that we have available, where in some cases, I think, even multiplying it massively doesn't really help.
Okay.
There are some areas, I think, so the recovery trial in the United Kingdom was the randomized controlled trial of various interventions to try and help with COVID, therapeutic interventions, not vaccines, therapeutic interventions after the fact. And, the discovery of dexamethasone, the steroid, which can, it probably, I have, I'm a Bayesian, I never have certainty, but I have 99.9% confidence that that's a robust intervention, and it's going to make a great deal of difference. And the reason we know that is because we had a very, very large randomized controlled trial, well conducted, and so on. And so I absolutely agree with you. That I'm not. I do want to distinguish. I'm not a cynic. I don't believe it's all hopeless. There are some, but I think it's because the more sensitive we are to the ways in which things can go wrong, the more likely we are to get them closer to right. So that's the other.
Okay. Yes.
I don't hope that's helpful in some way.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Mahmoud Khalid.
Sir, thank you very much for a very nice talk and really thought-provoking. My simple question is that does the evidence generation change if the person who is doing this activity has a different requirement? For example, decision makers, for example, those who are evaluating those decision makers, such as the ones which are basically doing the monitoring and evaluation. And thirdly, those which want to just do prophecies, such as researchers. So do you think that the evidence in all the cases would be different? And my second question, since you in the flyer you were also mentioned as a broadcaster, that does the evidence really matter nowadays? For example, if something comes out in the social media, just as in kind of a running video, which is basically not based on any kind of data-based evidence generation or whatsoever, but that appeals to the people's mind more. So what would be more effective in terms of persuading the people? Thank you.
Well, I have a slightly strange view about the problem of social media, which is, as I hinted earlier, that in some cases it's better not to be persuasive at all. So there is a question about trust and trustworthiness, I think, that arises here. Everybody wants to be trusted, and we often say that there needs to be more trust. We have a trust deficit, and this kind of concept. Well, I think that's a slightly silly way of putting things. You do not want to trust people. You do not want more trust in people who are untrustworthy. Well, so what really matters is whether they demonstrate by their behavior that they are trustworthy, not that they are just seeking to get your trust somehow, so you should believe in me because I'm authoritative, whatever. I mean, and that suggests that one of the things that we sometimes become a little suspicious of is those people who seem to be trying to persuade us the hardest. So does persuasion encourage trustworthiness? I don't think it does. So my slightly weird response, and I appreciate that I'm unusual in this respect, that I'm not trying to tell everybody, trust me, trust me, trust me. I'm trying to tell everybody, I really am going to stop trying to persuade you. I'm going to try to give you information as far as I can, and then I'm going to leave you to decide. And what I would hope is that that would enhance their trust in the information. So I make this distinction, which touches on your first point, between who is gathering the data and what they're doing it for. I think it's quite important not to be one of the people who's trying to put your thumb in the scale of what we should do when you're also claiming to be an independent, impartial, objective analyst of data or even collector of data. If you want your authority as a collector of data to be robust, don't, I would suggest, start trying to use it to make confident policy prescriptions. You can leave that to somebody else. Now, I think that's probably a naive view. I think in practice, it's extremely hard to achieve that. I think in many ways, there's a strong counter argument that, you know, if you know the data, then you're the person, exactly the person who should be making the recommendations about policy and so on. So I appreciate that that's controversial. Nevertheless, I think the risks are clear. If you try to persuade, you invite questions about whether you're honest. It's as difficult as that, I think. And so sometimes it pays just to pull back slightly and say, I'm not trying to lean on you. I will do, now, is there any such thing as independent, objective, impartial information? Is it possible to say anything without some measurement? No, probably not, actually. But, you know, there is clearly a scale here, and we can move along it one way or the other. We can get very heavy, or we can try to be as restrained as possible. And my inclination is to try to be, you know, restrained and just offer evidence rather than persuasion. Do people have different uses, needs, interpretations of the data according to their job? Yes, I think they do, and I think that's reasonably fair. I think political decision makers are in an invidious position where they have to, one of the things they have to do is motivate people. You know, you have to carry people with you. You have to generate some enthusiasm, some conviction that this is going to be worthwhile. And so there, I think it's an extremely difficult judgment. You know, how scrupulous should we be about the uncertainties? When if you tell everybody, you know, oh, it's all so uncertain, they're going to say, well, in that case, I won't bother. You know, we have to try and move. So yes, I do think that different places probably are going to find different emphases, different interpretations, and so on. But I think there is a general argument which says, again, we reject cynicism. We will not stand here and do nothing. We will do everything to our very best, you know, the best of our endeavors to improve the conditions of life for our population. But we are aware that it may not work exactly as we intend. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And we'll experiment. And we'll assess these things with as robustly as we can to find those areas where we really do have more confidence that we're going to make a difference. So I think there's a kind of meta case, which sort of, I hope, would encourage a little bit of forgiveness about not having to kind of bang the war drum every time you start a policy. And say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to try and get you all marching down the streets in support of our latest big thing, you know. We're going to try and encourage some patience and some reflection, but we're going to do it fully committed, sensitive to the possibility that it may not work. So I think, you know, possibly we could improve there a little bit, but I fully accept your point that different people in different positions in life will have different emphases here.
Thank you. Abbas Musfi?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you
Yep.
are.
Mr. Michael, this has been very fascinating. Thank you for the time. Appreciate it. I have a quick question. So one of the primary reasons for this drive towards fabricating certainty and manufacturing outrage and so on and so forth is the increasing corporatization of the media landscape, right? Which is geared to sort of maximizing revenues through views rather than highlighting complicated realities. And this is largely also true for academia and even social media and places like YouTube and so on. How do you think the incentive structures can be revised in order to promote nuance and complexity? Would people even tune into something like that? Do they have the time to get into the nitty-gritty details of important events? And are these not the very incentive structures responsible for increasing levels of political polarization around the world? So what can we do about all of these things? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very pertinent question. And I think your analysis is correct. And I'm pleased that you said it extends into science as well as in the social media. I think you're right about that as well. I think, you know, competition to get yourself into the journals and the way that the journals look for novelty, large claims and so on. The way that, you know, people self-censor. If they have null findings or inconclusive findings, they put them in the file drawer. They don't even expect to be published. And that means, you know, that in order to get grants and so on, that we are susceptible to the same incentives, you know, to inflate and exaggerate and oversimplify and all the rest. Are there things we can do about that? Well, in science, I don't know how much you've seen of the open science movement. If you haven't seen it much, I urge you to discover it. So in Europe and the United States, largely in a reaction to the replication problems initially in psychology, but across steadily across more and more of the social sciences, we've seen a reaction to that, which has started to emphasize collective work rather than individual reputation. There's a very interesting publishing model called Octopus, which is about to launch in the UK, which doesn't sort of give all the glory to one principal investigator. It tries to allow people to publish part works. So, you know, the individual contributions to a paper, you know, very often these papers, they have multiple authors and different people have done different things on them. So in order to try and stop the kind of storytelling layer that goes on top of that, could we look at the parts, you know, and would that be a way of the contribution to a whole? And could that be a way of allowing people to achieve recognition without saying to them, you're going to have to bang the drum and wave the flag and claim all sorts of things that aren't really realistic? So I think there are some moves in science which I think are quite promising. There are open science and reproducibility movements within quite a lot of of the European countries now and in the United States. We've seen much more effort at reproducibility. So it was the case that if you simply tried to reproduce a trial or something, reproduce an experiment, nobody was interested. Why is that? Why, you know, who cares? You know, it's been done. You're doing it again. Who wants to know about that? You know, but I think those kind of efforts, because they have been, and this is unpleasant but true, they have been humiliating. You know, they've been extremely uncomfortable for some of the people initially involved, you know, as the fragilities of those initial claims have been questioned and tested and found wanting. And that's not a pleasant feeling. Now, that is quite a powerful incentive, to have your work revisited. And so you say, well, how do we encourage this revisiting and retesting and so on? And I say, well, we do things like the journals say you can't submit unless all your data is open and available for other people to interrogate, for example. So there are some partial fixes. The large scale problem about incentives, in which too many people really do have money riding on winding up the audience. I do not know what to do about that. I find it depressing. Is there still a space for nuance? Well, you're here, you know, and I'm trying, and I think there are parts of the media which do still, and I'm not hopeless about it. And I think those of us who care about effective policy and evidence-based policy in areas like politics, social policy, medicine, where what matters is, well, what matters in medicine is not what's on Twitter. It really doesn't. I mean, I know that there are people in the United States overdosing on ivermectin horse tranquilizer or whatever it is. Not horse tranquilizer, horse dewormer, isn't it? I know that that happens, but it doesn't happen much, I don't think. On the whole, the medical establishment is still interested in evidence, overwhelmingly, the quality of the evidence. That constituency will never go away. So I'm not hopeless about it, but I accept that the headwinds from social media and elsewhere and the interests there are pretty strong.
Last question, Khuravilai.
Thank you, Michael, for such an enlightening talk. My question is, like 120 years back, when we talk about natural science, which deals with more objective part of the universe, encompassed what you are trying to convince us for. They talked about Heisenberg uncertainty principle. They talked about Schrodinger's cat. They talked about spooky behavior of the universe. And due to that, today we're looking at a new universe, minimum in the matter part of the universe. So why do you think that in social science, we are so obsessed with certainty while the more objective sciences are moving towards uncertainty? As like in Yevgeny said in his novel V, that I don't want rationality and certainty. I want square root of -1 so I can smile. So I think, and I need your comment over it, that don't you think that uncertainty is the greatest essence of the universe, which we are continuously ignoring from so long? And sciences like quantum physics actually grasped it and reached somewhere.
I think you have a point. I'm not an expert in physics. I'm a long way from any expertise in physics, but I watch and try to understand quantum uncertainty as best I can, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And it is striking. God doesn't play dice, I think, is the attitude that the social sciences still have. A belief that we can sort of isolate causes in a peculiar way. We can be sure about interventions having measurable effects and the rest of it. But as we now know from physics, as you point out, God does appear to play dice in some fundamental way. And, it would be surprising if that weren't also the case. Either that or that the ideas about chaos theory, where initial conditions are so sensitive to the initial setup or so sensitive to further, intrusive interventions, that predicting the outcome becomes almost impossible. Why would it be that complex social systems are different? That seems to me to be a very powerful analogy, really. And I've used it in the past, even though I don't claim to understand it, as part of the argument for encouraging more uncertainty in the social sciences. And as you say, it changes the way that you look at the world. I'll add one more thing, because I suspect you're the last question, which is that sometimes I get a reaction from people, which is uncertainty is a very bleak creed. It frightens me. Well, it doesn't frighten me. I find it curiously liberating. I don't want to be nailed down as a sort of wholly determined creature. Whether there's real free will or not, that's a rather complicated question. But I much prefer the illusion of things being uncertain than things being certain in an odd way. I even find complexity, some people say that certainty, simplicity, and so on are in some way more elegant, more aesthetically attractive. I don't agree with that either. I think looking at the complexity of the social world and the natural world just fills me with wonder. So I'm a little puzzled about the resistance, which I think we see in social sciences and elsewhere in life, that says, no, we want to hang on to this kind of deterministic model for as long as we can. More than that, we want to be able to say that it's an ascertainable deterministic model. In all its detail. And why? I mean, it's nice for research. You can you can make a name if you find something deterministically influencing, that nobody's seen before. But I don't think it's nice for humanity to feel that life is like that. it might mean that in some areas we can intervene to improve things, but the overall message, you know, that we're all on train tracks, no. So it could be, you know, that I'm guilty of a massive confirmation bias because I don't like that, you know, and so I seek evidence to support my own view. So back to the doctor's, you know, observation that it's all confirmation bias. Really, maybe it is. Maybe I'm as guilty of that as everybody else. But no, thank you for the question. I agree. I think the physics example is quite powerful.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I think this is wonderful. I really needed for us to hear your book because I was quite moved by it. I was quite intrigued by it, and it's kind of that hidden nerve somewhere that data is not as sound as it is, and that uncertainty is something that we live in an age where we really think that the machines are now predictable and we can do everything with machines, and we are. I mean, there's a certain fair amount of stuff that we've achieved. I'm not taking away all the achievements,
no.
But especially in terms of the policy circle and in terms of where we are in economics, we really need to get a fresh dose of your book, and you gave that to us. I'm grateful to you. A number of researchers, our students will hear the video and will really be educated. I thank you, and I look forward to your future work.
Well, it's very kind of you. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and the questions have been inspiring as well, and you know, so to the point. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.